Okay, I'd help if my microphone was positioned correctly. Let's get my microphone positioned correct. Don't drop in my face. Stay. I think that's going to stay. If it pulls down and bops me on the head, I'll have to move it. Okay, getting ready for another session on Sense and Sensibility, the multicast recording. Just get everything switched on. That would help. Turn my little speaker on. All right, bring in my recording program. All right, so I got through 7 chapters in each of the first 2 sessions, which I completed. Just check that's all good. All my settings are correct. Yes. So we'll see how much I get today. I'm going to go out for tea with a friend in about an hour and a half, and I reckon I should get at least another 7 chapters, maybe more. So, where am I? Chapter 15 is where I'm up to. I hope if I give my screen a clean once in a while, but it'll do for now. All right. Sip my drink. Dab of lip balm. Lip balm's an essential in any narrator's booth. We get dry lips very quickly. There we go. Oh, no, don't stand on the keyboard. That's not going to help anything. Chapter 15. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, and 2 of her daughters went with her, but Marianne excused herself from being of the party under some trifling pretext of employment, and her mother, who concluded that a promise had been made by Willoughby the night before of calling on her while they were absent, was perfectly satisfied with her remaining at home. On their return from the park, they found Willoughby's curricle and servant in waiting at the cottage, and Mrs. Dashwood was convinced that her conjecture had been just. So far, it was all as she had foreseen, but on entering the house, she beheld what no foresight had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlour, apparently in violent affliction, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them ran up the stairs. Bugger, that was ran upstairs, not ran up the stairs. Go back, try it again. Small silly mistakes like that. My inner editor has a habit of putting in extra words here and there. Taught her to expect. So far, it was all as she had foreseen, but on entering the house... Oh no, I've just done that sentence. Grr. Had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlour, apparently in violent affliction, with her... violent. Violence, not violet. Not a good start. Let's try it again. Had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlour, apparently in violent affliction, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them, ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, not they had just quitted. Ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, where they found only Willoughby, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his... I'm not having a good day. I'll just have to work through it, but some days it's not a good start. I've not even got through a full minute yet, and I'm stumbling my way. Ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, where they found only Willoughby, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his back towards them. He turned round on their coming in, and his countenance showed that he strongly partook of the emotion which overpowered Marianne. Cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered. He replied, trying to look cheerful, and with a forced smile presently added. He coloured as he replied. His colour increased, and with his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied. Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise. Eleanor felt equal amazement. For a few moments, everyone was silent. Mrs. Dashwood first spoke. He stopped. Mrs. Dashwood was too much astonished to speak, and another pause succeeded. This was broken by Willoughby, who said with a faint smile. He then hastily took leave of them all and left the room. They saw him step into his carriage, and in a minute it was out of sight. I need to hiccup, sorry. Okay, that was a little smoother. Keep going. It was out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood felt too much for speech, and instantly quitted the parlour to give way in solitude to the concern and alarm which this sudden departure occasioned. Eleanor's uneasiness was at least equal to her mother's. She thought of what had just passed with anxiety and distrust. Willoughby's behaviour in taking leave of them, his embarrassment and affectation of cheerfulness, and, above all, his unwillingness to accept her mother's invitation, a backwardness so unlike a lover, so unlike himself, greatly disturbed her. One moment she feared that no serious design had ever been formed on his side, and the next that some unfortunate quarrel had taken place between him and her sister. The distress in which Marianne had quitted the room was such as a serious quarrel could most reasonably account for, though when she considered what Marianne's love for him was, a quarrel seemed almost impossible. But whatever might be the particulars of their separation, her sister's affliction was indubitable, and she thought with the tenderest compassion of that violent sorrow which Marianne was, in all probability, not merely giving way to as a relief, but feeding and encouraging as a duty. In about half an hour her mother returned, and though her eyes were red, her countenance was not uncheerful. Said Mrs. Dashwood, as she sat down to work. Just looking for some more lines of mine. There is something at the end. Hang on. That was too big a gap. Let me just go back. Okay. I've got a couple of paragraphs at the end of the chapter. They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think over the representations of her mother, to acknowledge the probability of many, and hope for the justice of all. They saw nothing of Marianne till dinner time, when she entered the room and took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and swollen, and it seemed as if her tears were even then restrained with difficulty. She avoided the looks of them all, could neither eat nor speak, and after some time, on her mother's silently pressing her hand with tender compassion, her small degree of fortitude was quite overcome. She burst into tears and left the room. This violent oppression of spirits continued the whole evening. She was without any power, because she was without any desire of command over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, it was... over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, it was impossible for them, if they spoke at all, to keep clear of every subject with which her feelings connected to him. Over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, It was impossible for them, if they spoke at all, to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. Well, I made a hot mess of that chapter. What was that? About 7 takes and only 5 minutes to show for it. Phew. Oh well. Some days you just start off and it doesn't go well. But press on. Got it done. Press on. Let's see how much more we can get. Chapter 15. And back it up. All right, next up. Chapter 16. Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. But the feelings which made such composure a disgrace left her in no danger of incurring it. She was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to talk, and unwilling to take any nourishment, giving pain every moment to her mother and sisters, and forbidding all attempt at consolation from either. Her sensibility was potent enough. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment and crying over the present reverse for the chief of the morning. The evening passed off in the equal indulgence of feeling. She played over every favourite song that she had been used to play to Willoughby, every air in which their voices had been oftenest joined, and sat at the instrument, gazing on every line of music that he had written out for her, till her heart was so heavy that no farther sadness could be gained, and this nourishment of grief was every day applied. She spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying, her voice often totally suspended by her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery which a contrast between the past and present was past and present, not past and presents. There is no gift giving here, past and present. By her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had been used to read together. Such violence of affliction indeed could not be supported for ever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy, but these employments, to which she daily recurred, her solitary walks and silent meditations, still produced occasional effusions of sorrow as lively as ever. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again became uneasy. But Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, which at least satisfied herself. Eleanor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find in it a motive sufficient for their silence. But there was one method so direct, so simple, and in her opinion so eligible of knowing the real state of the affair, and of instantly removing all mystery, that she could not help suggesting it to her mother. Eleanor thought this generosity overstrained, considering her sister's youth, and urged the matter farther, but in vain. Common sense, common care, common prudence were all sunk in Mrs. Dashwood's romantic delicacy. It was several days before Willoughby's name was mentioned before Marianne by any of her family. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings indeed were not so nice. Their witticisms added pain to many a painful hour, but one evening Mrs. Dashwood, accidentally taking up a volume of Shakespeare, exclaimed, Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but it gave Eleanor pleasure, as it produced a reply from Marianne so expressive of confidence in Willoughby and knowledge of his intentions. One morning, about a week after his leaving the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. Hitherto, she had carefully avoided every companion in her rambles. Sisters intended to walk on the downs. She directly stole away toward the lanes. Towards the lanes. Hmm. In her rambles. If her sisters intended to walk on the downs, she directly stole away towards the lanes. If they talked of the valley, she was as speedy in climbing the hills, and could never be found when the others set off. But at length she was secured by the exertions of Eleanor, who greatly disapproved such continual seclusion. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence, for Marianne's mind could not be controlled, and Eleanor, satisfied with gaining one point, would not then attempt more. Beyond the entrance of the valley, where the country, though still rich, was less wild and more open, a long stretch of the road which they had travelled on first coming to Barton lay before them, and on reaching that point they stopped to look around them and examine the prospect which formed the distance of their view from the cottage, from a spot which they had never happened to reach in any of their walks before. Amongst the objects in the scene, they soon discovered an animated one. It was a man on horseback riding towards them. In a few minutes they could distinguish him to be a gentleman, and in a moment afterwards Marianne rapturously exclaimed, and was hastening to meet him, when Eleanor cried out. She walked eagerly on as she spoke, and Eleanor, to screen Marianne from particularity, as she felt almost certain of its not being Willoughby, quickened her pace and kept up with her. They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again, her heart sunk within her, and abruptly turning round, she was hurrying back, when the voices of both her sisters were raised to detain her. A third, almost as well known as Willoughby's, joined them in begging her to stop, and she turned round with surprise to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, the only one who could have gained a smile from her, but she dispersed her tears to smile on him, and in her sister's happiness forgot for a time her own disappointment. He dismounted, and giving his horse to his servant, walked back with them to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit them. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially by Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Eleanor herself. To Marianne, indeed, the meeting between Edward and her sister was but a continuation of that unaccountable coldness which she had often observed at Norland in their mutual behaviour. On Edward's side, more particularly, there was a deficiency of all that a lover ought to look and say on such an occasion. He was confused, seemed scarcely sensible of pleasure in seeing them, looked neither rapturous nor gay, said little but what was forced from him by questions, and distinguished Eleanor by no mark of affection. Marianne saw and listened with increasing surprise. She began almost to feel a dislike of Edward, and it ended, as every feeling must end with her, by carrying back her thoughts to Willoughby, whose manners formed a contrast sufficiently striking to those of his brother-elect. After a short silence which succeeded the first surprise and inquiries of meeting, Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire a fortnight. Marianne repeated, surprised at his being so long in the same county with Eleanor without seeing her before. Said Eleanor. As she said this, she sunk into a reverie for a few moments, but rousing herself again. Edward smiled. Said Marianne to herself as she walked on. Eleanor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavoured to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc. Ex- Eleanor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavoured to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc., extorting from him occasional questions and remarks. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her better to him. I don't have enough breath for that sentence. Let's try again, find a different breathing point. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her behaviour to him by the past rather than the present, she avoided every appearance of resentment or displeasure, and treated him as she thought he ought to be treated from the family connection. Okay. And stop. No, stop. Oh, don't be a pain. Okay. All right. And save that one. And did I back it up? Yes, I did. Chapter 17. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised only for a moment at seeing him, for his coming to Barton was, in her opinion, of all things the most natural. Her joy and expression of regard long outlived her wonder. The house, and they were quite overcome by the captivating manners of Mrs. Dashwood. Indeed, a man could not very well be in love with either of her daughters without extending the passion to her, and Eleanor had the self. His aim perceptible. He was not in spirits, however. He praised their house, admired its prospect, was attentive and kind, but still he was not in spirits. The whole family perceived it, and Mrs. Dashwood, attributing it to some want of liberality in his mother, sat down to table indignant against all selfish parents. Said she, when dinner was over. Eleanor laughed. Eleanor smiled again to hear her sister describing so accurately their future expenses at Combe Magna. Marianne coloured as she... Oh, I've got another hiccup, excuse me. Marianne coloured as she replied. Said Margaret, striking out a novel thought. Cried Marianne, her eyes sparkling with animation and her cheeks glowing with the delight of such imaginary happiness. Marianne looked as if she had no doubt on that point. Edward sighed. Said Edward to Eleanor. Replied Eleanor, looking expressively at Marianne. Edward started. Edward blushed. Eleanor looked surprised at his emotion, but trying to laugh off the subject, she said to him. Edward made no answer. His gravity and thoughtfulness returned on him in their fullest extent. Something just went creak in here then, that was not helpful. Try Try it again. Edward made no answer. His gravity and thoughtfulness returned on him in their fullest extent, and he sat for some time silent and dull. The funny thing is, all these chapters are actually all about the same length, but my part in them is often not. I had 8 minutes in the last chapter and just dead on 3 in this one. So it's very variable. The final product sounds amazing, I tell you. And all the other actors have had their parts cut in. And back it up. Yes. Yes. Did that actually? I don't think that actually did it. Sorry. Hang on. Save. Oh, no, it's already backed up. All right. Oh, stop it. Okay. What's that? 17, 18. Okay. Chapter 18. Eleanor saw with great uneasiness the low spirits of her friend. His visit afforded her but a very partial satisfaction, while his own enjoyment in it appeared so imperfect. It was evident that he was unhappy. She wished it were equally evident that he still distinguished her by the same affection which once she had felt no doubt of inspiring, but hitherto the continuance of his preference seemed very uncertain, and the reservedness of his manner towards her contradicted one moment what a more animated look had intimated the preceding one. He joined her and Marianne in the breakfast room the next morning before the others were down, and Marianne, who was always eager to promote their happiness as far as she could, soon left them to themselves. But before she was halfway upstairs, she heard the parlour door open, and turning round, was astonished to see Edward himself come out. Edward returned to them with fresh admiration of the surrounding country. In his walk to the village, he had seen many parts of the valley to advantage, and the village itself, in a much higher situation than the cottage, afforded a general view of the whole, which had exceedingly pleased him. This was a subject which ensured Marianne's attention, and she was beginning to describe her own admiration of these scenes, and to question him more minutely on the objects that had particularly struck him, when Edward interrupted her by saying, from Mrs. Dashwood, his hand passed so directly before her as to make a ring with a plait of hair in the centre, very conspicuous on one of his fingers. Marianne spoke inconsiderately what she really felt, but when she saw how much she had pained Edward, her own vexation at her want of thought could not be surpassed by his. He coloured very deeply, and giving a momentary glance at Eleanor, replied, Eleanor had met his eye, and looked conscious likewise. That the hair was her own, she instantaneously felt as well satisfied as Marianne. The only difference in their conclusions was, that what Marianne considered as a free gift from her sister, Eleanor was conscious must have been procured by... I don't know what a thrift is. Okay, let's go back and try that one again. Oh. So there's a big truck or a bus or something just passing by outside. Oh, why have I got glitches in the live? Stop it. Behave yourself. Right, let's try again. Conscious likewise. That the hair was her own, she instantaneously felt as well satisfied as Marianne. The only difference in their conclusions was, that what Marianne considered as a free gift from her sister, Eleanor was conscious, must have been procured by some theft or contrivance unknown to herself. She was not in a humour, however, to regard it as an affront, and affecting to take no notice of what passed by instantly talking of something else, she internally resolved henceforward to catch every opportunity of eyeing the hair and of satisfying herself, beyond all doubt, that it was exactly the shade of her own. Edward's embarrassment lasted some time, and it ended in an absence of mind still more settled. He was particularly grave the whole day. They were visited by Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, who, having heard of the arrival of a gentleman at the cottage, came to take a survey of the guest. With the assistance of his mother-in-law, Sir John was not long in discovering that the name of Ferrars began with an F, and this prepared a future mine of raillery against the devoted Eleanor, which nothing but the newness of their acquaintance with Edward could have prevented from being immediately sprung. But as it was, she only learned, from some very significant looks, how far their penetration, founded on Margaret's instructions, extended. Sir John never came to the Dashwoods without either inviting them to dine at the park the next day, or to drink tea with them that evening. On the present occasion, for the better entertainment of their visitor, towards whose amusement he felt himself bound to contribute, he wished to engage them for both. Mrs. Jennings enforced the necessity. This, and Marianne's blushing, gave new suspicions to Edward. Said he, in a low voice, to Miss Dashwood, by whom he was sitting. She gave him a brief reply. Marianne's countenance was more communicative. Edward saw enough to comprehend not only the meaning of others, but such of Marianne's expressions as had puzzled him. Edward saw enough to comprehend not only the meaning of others, but such of Marianne's expressions as has. I keep going ad has, and it's as had. Edward saw enough to comprehend not only the meaning of others, but such of Marianne's expressions as had puzzled him before, and when their visitors left them, he went immediately round her and said, in a whisper. Marianne was surprised and confused, yet she could not help smiling at the quiet archness of his manner, and after a moment's silence said, replied Edward, rather astonished at her earnestness and warmth, for had he not imagined it to be a joke? Replied Edward, rather astonished at her earnestness and warmth, for had he not imagined it to be a joke for the good of her acquaintance in general, founded only on a something or a nothing between Mr. Willoughby and herself, he would not have ventured to mention it. Alrighty, and that is chapter 18. Keep putting my hand on the wrong mouse. Back up. Okay, 5 minutes 42 seconds. 43, okay. And 19. Chapter 19. Edward remained a week at the cottage. He was earnestly pressed by Mrs. Dashwood to stay longer, but, as if he were bent only on self-mortification, he seemed resolved to be gone when his enjoyment among his friends was at the height. His spirits, during the last 2 or 3 days, though still very time to be wholly disengaged, even doubted to what place he should go when he left them, but still, go he must. Never had any week passed so quickly. He could hardly believe it to be gone. He said so repeatedly. Other things he said, too, which marked the turn of his feelings and gave the lie to his actions. He had no pleasure at Norland. He detested being, yet he must leave them at the end of a week, in spite of their wishes and his own, and without any restraint on his time. Eleanor placed all that was astonishing in this way of acting to his mother's account, and it was happy for her that he had a mother whose character was so imperfectly known to her on the airplane. I'm sorry about the glitchiness of the video stream. I don't quite know why my camera is playing up like this. I'm hoping that the audio is not also glitching because it's coming through a completely different pickup. It's not coming through a webcam pickup. But not all I can do about it. And designs. The shortness of his visit, the steadiness of his purpose in leaving them, originated in the same fettered inclination, the same inevitable necessity of temporizing with his mother. The old, well-established grievance of duty against will, parent against child, was the cause of all. She would have been glad to know when these difficulties were to cease, this opposition was to yield, when Mrs. Ferrars would be reformed, and her son be at liberty to be happy. But from such vain wishes she was forced to turn for comfort to the renewal of her confidence in Edward's affection, to the remembrance of every mark of regard, in look or word, which fell from him while at Barton, and above all, to that flattering proof of it which he constantly wore round his finger. Said Mrs. Dashwood, as they were at breakfast the last morning. Oh, hang on, there's an error there. There's a narrator line which is not marked. Go away. There it is. Okay, back to where it was. With a smile. This desponding turn of mind, though it could not be communicated to Mrs. Dashwood, gave additional pain to them all in the parting which shortly took place, and left an uncomfortable impression on Eleanor's feelings especially, which required some trouble and time to subdue. But as it was her determination to subdue it, and to prevent herself from appearing to suffer more than what all her family suffered on his going away, she did not adopt the method. I made a mess of that sentence. I'm going to start again. But as it was her determination to subdue it, and to prevent herself from appearing to suffer more than what all her family suffered on his going away, she did not adopt the method so judiciously employed by Marianne on a similar occasion, to augment and fix her sorrow by seeking silence, solitude, and idleness. Their means were as different as their objects, and equally suited to the advancement of each. Eleanor sat down to her drawing-table as soon as he was out of the house, busily employed herself the whole day, neither sought nor avoided the mention of his name, appeared to interest herself almost as much as ever in the general concerns of the family, and if, by this conduct, she did not lessen her own grief, it was at least prevented from unnecessary increase, and her mother and sisters were spared much solicitude on her account. Such behaviour as this, so exactly the reverse of her own, appeared no more meritorious to Marianne than her own had seemed faulty to her. The business of self-command she settled very easily. With strong affections it was impossible, with calm ones it could have no merit. That her sister's affections were calm, she dared not deny, though she blushed to acknowledge it, and of the strength of her own she gave a very striking proof, by still loving and respecting that sister, in spite of this mortifying conviction. Without shutting herself up from her family, or leaving the house in determined solitude to avoid them, or lying awake the whole night to indulge meditation, Eleanor found every day afforded her leisure enough to think of Edward, and of Edward's behaviour, in every possible variety which the different state of her spirits at different times could produce, with tenderness, pity, approbation, censure, and doubt. There were moments in abundance when, if not by the absence of her mother and sisters, at least by the nature of their employments, conversation was forbidden among them, and every effect of solitude was produced. Her mind was inevitably at liberty, her thoughts could not be chained elsewhere, and the past and the future, on a subject so interesting, must be before her, must force her attention, and engross her memory, her reflection, and her fancy. From a reverie of this kind, as she sat at her drawing table, she was roused one morning, soon after Edward's leaving them, by the arrival of company. She happened to be quite no. The arrival of company. She happened to be quite alone. Someone just shouting outside. Don't know what that was. I actually normally live in a very quiet area, but the arrival of company. She happened to be quite alone. The closing of the little gate at the entrance of the green court in front of the house drew her eyes to the window, and she saw a large party walking up to the door. Amongst them were Sir John and Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings, but there were two others, a gentleman and lady, who were quite unknown to her. She was sitting near the window, and as soon as Sir John perceived her, not perceived, quite unknown to her. She was sitting near the window, and as soon as Sir John perceived her, he left the rest of the party to the ceremony of knocking at the door, and stepping across the turf, obliged her to open the casement to speak to him, though the space was so short between the door and the window as to make it hardly possible to speak at one without being heard at the other. As Eleanor was certain of seeing her in a couple of minutes without taking that liberty, she begged to be excused. I don't. There's two lines marked there that I'm pretty sure are wrong. One's marked for Eleanor, one for Sir John, and I think they're the wrong way round. So I'm just going to correct that. Okay. Try and correct them as I go along because other people haven't. I think Eleanor's parts might have been recorded, but I don't think everyone else's has yet. They were now joined by Mrs. Jennings, who had not patience enough to wait till the door was opened before she told her story. She came hallooing to the window. Eleanor was obliged to turn from her in the middle of her story to receive the rest of the party. Lady Middleton introduced the two strangers. Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret came downstairs at the same time, and they all sat down to look at one another, while Mrs. Jennings continued her story as she walked through the passage into the parlour, attended by Sir John. She was short and plump, had a very pretty face, an expression of good humour in it that could possibly be. In every respect. She was short and plump, had a very pretty face, and the finest expression of good humour in it that could possibly be. Her manners were by no means so elegant as her sister's, but they were much more prepossessing. She came in with a smile, smiled all the time of her visit, except when she laughed, and smiled when she went away. Her husband was a grave-looking young man of 5 or 26, with an air of more fashion and sense than his wife, but of less willingness to please or be pleased. He entered the room with a look of self-consequence, slightly bowed to the ladies, without speaking a word, read it as long as he stayed. Mrs. Palmer, on the contrary, who was strongly endowed by nature with a turn for being uniformly civil and happy, was hardly seated before her admiration of the parlour and everything in it burst forth. turning to Mrs. Dashwood. Mr. Palmer made her no answer, and did not even raise his eyes from the newspaper. Mrs. Palmer laughed. This was quite a new idea to Mrs. Dashwood. She had never been used to find wit in the inattention of anyone, and could not help looking with surprise at them both. Mrs. Jennings, in the meantime, talked on as loud as she could, and continued her account of their surprise, the evening before, on seeing their friends, without ceasing till everything was told. Mrs. Palmer laughed heartily at the recollection of their astonishment, and everybody agreed, 2 or 3 times over, that it had been quite an agreeable surprise. Added Mrs. Jennings, leaning forward towards Eleanor, and speaking in a low voice as if she meant to be heard by no one else, though they were seated on different sides of the room. There's another line there. Why has this one got so many errors in it? Okay, where are we? I'm going to get a couple more pages to go. Lady Middleton could no longer endure such a conversation, and therefore exerted herself to ask Mr. Palmer if there was any news in the paper. Mr. Palmer, oh, sorry, gurgly throat, opened the front door and ushered her in himself. Mrs. Jennings asked her, as soon as she appeared, if she had not been to Allenham, and Mrs. newspaper. Mrs. Palmer's eye was now caught by the drawings which hung round the room. She got up to imagine them. Imagine them. Examine them. Sorry, my eye was actually caught by another error a bit further down the page. An awful to the dialogue in this, and a couple of it's misattributed. What a pain. And I was looking at that rather than the actual line I was supposed to be reading. Let's try again. Which hung round the room. She got up to examine them. And then, sitting down again, she very soon forgot that there were any such things in the room. He made her no answer, and only observed, after again examining the room, that it was very low-pitched, and that the ceiling was crooked. He then made, but they had no curiosity to see how Mr. and Mrs. Palmer ate their dinner, and no expectation of pleasure from them in any other way. Hiccup again. The other way. They attempted, therefore, likewise to excuse themselves. The weather was uncertain, and not likely to be good. But Sir John would not be satisfied. The carriage should be sent for them, and they must come. Lady Middleton, too, though she did not press their mother, pressed them. Mrs. Jennings and Mrs. Palmer joined their entreaties. All seemed equally anxious to avoid a family party, and the young ladies were obliged to yield. Said Marianne, as soon as they were gone. Getting warm, I need a moment. Chapter 20. As the Miss Dashwoods entered the drawing-room of the park the next day, at one door, Mrs. Palmer came running in at the other, looking as good-humoured and merry as before. She took them all most affectionately by the hand, and expressed great delight in seeing them again. Said she, seating herself between Eleanor and Marianne. They were obliged to put an end to such an expectation. Mrs. Palmer laughed gaily. They thanked her, but were obliged to resist all her entreaties. Began complaining of the weather. The rest of the company soon dropped in. Marianne looked very grave and said nothing. Marianne remained perfectly silent, though her countenance betrayed her interest in what was said. Charlotte laughed heartily to think that her husband could not get rid of her, and exultingly said she did not care how cross he was to her, as they must live together. It was impossible for anyone to be more thoroughly good-natured or must live together. It was impossible for anyone to be more thoroughly good-natured or more determined to be happy than Mrs. Palmer. The studied indifference, insolence, not insolence, than Mrs. Palmer. The studied indifference, insolence, and discontent of her husband gave her no pain, and when he scolded or abused her, she was highly diverted. Said she, in a whisper, to Eleanor. Eleanor was not inclined, after a little observation, to give him credit for being so genuinely and unaffectedly ill-natured or ill-bred as he wished to appear. His temper might perhaps be a little soured by finding, like many others of his sex, that through some unaccountable bias in favour of beauty, he was the husband of a very silly woman, but she knew that this kind of blunder was too common for any sensible man to be lastingly hurt by it. It was rather a wish of distinction, she believed, which produced his contemptuous treatment of everybody and his general abuse of everything before him. It was the desire of appearing superior to other people. The motive was too common to be wondered at. The means, however they might succeed by establishing his superiority in ill-breeding, were not likely to attach anyone to him except his wife. Applying to her husband, they both eagerly and resolutely declined her invitation. Eleanor could hardly keep her countenance as she assented to the hardship of such an obligation. Not an inclination, an obligation. Oh, hang on. Something loud passing by. Eleanor could hardly keep her countenance as she assented to the hardship of such an obligation. Mr. Palmer took no notice of her. She surprised Eleanor very much as they returned into the drawing-room by asking her whether she did not like Mr. Palmer excessively. Eleanor was again obliged to decline her invitation, and by changing the subject, put a stop to her entreaties. She thought it probable that as they lived in the same county, Mrs. Palmer might be able to give some more particular account of Willoughby's general character than could be gathered from the Middletons' partial acquaintance with him, and she was eager to gain from any one such a confirmation of his merits as might remove the possibility of fear from Marianne. She began by inquiring if they saw much of Mr. Willoughby at Cleveland, and whether they were intimately acquainted with him. Mrs. Palmer's information respecting Willoughby was not very material, but any testimony in his favour, however small, was pleasing to her. Continued Charlotte. she added in a low voice. Okay, now we will stop there. Okay. Oh, chapter 20, I'm cracking on. Do I have the next one up and ready? Yes, I do. Chapter 21. The Palmers returned to Cleveland the next day, and the two families at Barton were again left to entertain each other. But this did not last long. Eleanor had hardly got their last visitors out of her head, had hardly done wondering at Charlotte's being so happy without a cause, at Mr. Palmer's acting so simply, with good abilities, and at the strange unsuitableness which often existed between husband and wife, before Sir John's and Mrs. Jennings's active zeal in the cause of society procured her directly to the park as soon as their present engagements at Exeter were over. Their engagements at Exeter instantly gave way before such an invitation, and Lady Middleton was thrown into no little alarm on the return of Sir John by hearing. Their engagements at Exeter instantly gave way before such an invitation, and Lady Middleton was thrown into no little alarm on the return of Sir John by hearing that she was very soon to receive a visit from two girls whom she had never seen in her life, and of whose elegance, whose tolerable gentility even, she could have no proof, for the assurances of her husband and mother on that subject went for nothing at all. Their being her relations too made it so much the worse, and Mrs. Jennings's attempts at consolation were therefore unfortunately founded, when she advised her daughter not to care about their being so fashionable, because they were all cousins, and must put up with one another. As it was impossible, however, now to prevent their coming, Lady Middleton resigned herself to the idea of it, with all the philosophy of a well-bred woman, contenting herself with merely giving her husband a gentle reprimand on the subject, 5 or 6 times every day. The young ladies arrived. Their appearance was by no means ungenteel or unfashionable. Their dress was very smart, their manners very civil. They were delighted with the house, and in raptures with the furnace so Lady Middleton's good opinion was engaged in their favour before they had been an hour at the park. She declared them to be very agreeable girls indeed, which for her ladyship... No. Oh, crap. Tell him I've got an error. That's okay. I'll come back and check it in a minute. An hour at the park. She declared them to be very agreeable girls indeed, which for her ladyship was enthusiastic admiration. Sir John's confidence in his own judgment rose with this animated praise, and he set off directly for the cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods of the Miss Steeles' arrival, and to assure them of their being the sweetest girls in the world. Another loud noise outside. Oh, that's going to have impinged on that last sentence. Blast. Admiration. Sir John's confidence in his own judgment rose with this animated praise, and he set off directly for the cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods of the Miss Steeles' arrival, and to assure them of their being the sweetest girls in the world. From such commendation as this, however, there was not much to be learned. Eleanor well knew that the sweetest girls in the world were to be met with in every part of England, under every possible variation of form, face, temper, and understanding. Sir John wanted the whole family, I don't know what a family is, and understanding. Sir John wanted the whole family to walk to the park directly and look at his guests. Benevolent, philanthropic man. It was painful to him even to keep a third cousin to himself. But Sir John could not prevail. He could only obtain a promise of their calling at the park within a day or two, and then left them in amazement at their indifference, to walk home and boast anew of their attractions to the Miss Steeles, as he had already been boasting of the Miss Steeles to them. When their promised visit to the park and consequent introduction to these young ladies took place, they found in the appearance of the eldest, who was nearly 30, with a very plain and not a sensible face, nothing to admire, but in the other, who was not more than 2 or 3 and 20, they acknowledged considerable beauty. Her features were pretty, and she had a sharp, quick eye, and a smartness of air, though, blast. God, it's another 120-word sentence. There. To them. When their promised visit to the park and consequent introduction to these young ladies took place, they found in the appearance of the eldest, who was nearly 30, with a very plain and not a sensible face, nothing to admire, but in the other, who was not more than 2 or 3 and 20, they acknowledged considerable beauty. Her features were pretty, and she had a sharp, quick eye, and a smartness of air, which, though it did not give actual elegance or grace, gave distinction to her person. Their manners were particularly civil, and Eleanor soon allowed them credit for some kind of sense, when she saw with what constant and judicious attention they were making themselves agreeable to Lady Middleton. With her children they were in continual raptures, extolling their beauty, courting their notice, and humouring their whims, and such of their time as could be spared for the importunate demands which this politeness made on it, was spent in admiration of whatever her ladyship was doing, if she happened to be doing anything, or in taking patterns of some elegant new dress, in which her appearance the day before had thrown them into unceasing delight. Fortunately for those who pay their court through such foibles, a fond mother, though in pursuit of praise for her children, the most rapacious of human beings, is likewise the most credulous. Her demands are exorbitant, but she will swallow anything, and the excessive affection and I've got just enough space there. I could probably get away with restarting the middle of that one. But she will swallow anything. And the excessive affection and endurance of the Miss Steeles towards her offspring were viewed, therefore, by Lady Middleton without the smallest surprise or distrust. She saw with maternal complacency all the impertinent encroachments and mischievous tricks to which her cousins submitted. She saw... Oh, no, that was a creak. I'm going to have to redo that, because that was in the middle of that sentence. How annoying. Or distrust. She saw with maternal complacency all the impertinent encroachments and mischievous tricks to which her cousins submitted. She saw their sashes untied, their hair pulled about their ears, their work-bags searched, and their knives and scissors stolen away, and felt no doubt of its being a reciprocal enjoyment. It suggested no other surprise than that Eleanor and Marianne should sit so composedly by, without claiming a share in what was passing. Said Lady Middleton, on his taking Miss Steele's pocket-handkerchief and throwing it out of the window. And soon afterwards, on the second boy's violently pinching one of the same lady's fingers, she fondly observed, she added, tenderly caressing a little girl of 3 years old, who had not made a noise for the last 2 minutes. But unfortunately, in bestowing these embraces, a pin in her ladyship's headdress slightly scratching the child's neck, produced from this pattern of gentleness such violent screams as could hardly be outdone by any creature professedly noisy. The mother's consternation was excessive, but it could not surpass the alarm of the Miss Steeles, and everything was done by all three in so critical an emergency, which affection could suggest as likely to assuage by one of the Miss Steeles, who was on her knees to attend her, and her mouth stuffed with sugar plums the other. With such a reward for her tears, the child was too wise to cease crying. She still screamed and sobbed lustily, kicked her 2 brothers for offering to touch her, and all their united soothings were ineffectual unfortunate scratch, and a slight intermission of screams in the young lady on hearing it gave them reason to hope that it would not be rejected. She was carried out of the room, therefore, in her mother's arms in quest of this medicine, and as the two boys chose to follow, though earnestly entreated by their mother to stay behind, said Miss Steele, as soon as they were gone. Marianne was silent. It was impossible for her to say what she did not feel, however trivial the occasion, and upon Eleanor, therefore, the whole task of telling lies when politeness required it always fell. She did her best when thus called on, by speaking of Lady Middleton with more care. Always fell. She did her best when thus called on, by speaking of Lady Middleton. Always fell. She did her best when thus called on, by speaking of Lady Middleton with more warmth than she felt, though with far less than Miss Lucy. Here, too, Miss Dashwood's commendation, being only simple and just, came in without any éclat. She merely observed that he was perfectly good-humoured and friendly. Eleanor smiled. A short pause succeeded this speech, which was first broken by Miss Steele, who seemed very much disposed for conversation, and who now said rather abruptly, I'm going to have to redo that sentence, but that's okay. Pause for a drink anyway. Time is 3:15. Okay. Another noise outside. Grr. A short pause succeeded this speech, which was first broken by Miss Steele, who seemed very much disposed for conversation, and who now said rather abruptly, in some surprise at the familiarity of this question, or at least of the manner in which it was spoken, Eleanor replied that she was. Said Lucy, who seemed to think some apology necessary for the freedom of her sister. Said Lucy, looking ashamed of her sister. And then, to turn the discourse, she began admiring the house and the furniture. This specimen of the Miss Steeles was enough. The vulgar freedom and folly of the eldest left her no recommendation, and as Eleanor was not blinded by the beauty or the shrewd look of the youngest, to her want of real elegance and artlessness, she left the house without any wish of knowing them better. Not so the Miss Steeles. They came from Exeter, well provided with admiration for the use of Sir John Middleton, his family, and all his relations. Ooh, sorry, clank. The Miss Steeles. They came from Exeter, well provided with admiration for the use of Sir John Middleton, his family, and all his relations, and no niggardly proportion was now dealt out to his fair cousins, whom they declared to be the most beautiful his power reserve, by making the Miss Steeles acquainted with whatever he knew or supposed of his cousins' situations in the most delicate particulars, and Eleanor had not seen them more than twice, before the eldest of them wished her joy on her sister's having been so lucky as to make a conquest of a very smart beau since she came to Barton. Eleanor could not suppose that Sir John would be more nice in proclaiming his suspicions of her regard for Edward than he had been with respect to Marianne. Indeed, it was rather his favourite joke of the two, as being somewhat newer and more conjectural, and since Edward's visit they had never dined together without his drinking to her best affections with so much significancy and so many nods and winks as to excite general attention. The letter F had been likewise invariably brought forward, and found productive of such countless jokes, that its character as the wittiest letter in the alphabet had been long established with Eleanor. The Miss Steeles, as she expected, had now all the benefit of these jokes, and in the eldest of them they raised a curiosity to know the name of the gentleman alluded to, which, though often impertinently expressed, was perfectly of a piece with her general inquisitiveness into the concerns of their family. But Sir John did not sport long with the curiosity which he delighted to raise, for he had at least as much pleasure in telling the name as Miss Steele had in hearing it. Said he, in a very audible whisper, of Mr. Ferrars's name by Miss Steele when alluded to, or even openly mentioned by Sir John. And, oh no, it's good. It's all right. In between two sentences, it's one with a drop out. That's okay. Okay, now we're going to save chapter 21, and then I have to go. I have to do a quick Zoom call, and I'm going to meet up with a friend. So it's been good. I've got another 7 chapters down. I am more than happy with that. So, my lovelies, I will be off, and I will see you probably tomorrow. I'm planning to crack on and get the bulk of this done this weekend. So, catch you then.